Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. You know, one of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Only Boost Mobile will give you a free year of service when you buy a new 5G phone.
Oh, like a BOGO.
A BOGO?
Buy one, get one. BOGO.
Well, technically, it's buy one phone, get 1 year. So, Bop Goy.
Ah, Bop Goy. Get the Boost Mobile Bop Goy deal.
Bop Goy with Boost Mobile.
Bop Goy, Bop Goy, Bop Goy. This is the best idea we've ever had. When you purchase an eligible device, you get $25 off every month for 12 months with credits totaling 1 year of free service. Taxes extra for the device and service plan. Online only.
Hold that serve. There's no time for pickleball because you're going to want to hear this. Noom now has GLP-1s. No way! Oh, yes way, Fred. Psychology and meds. That's how Noom helps you lose the weight and keep it off.
That's really smart.
Oh, Danny, it's Noom smart. And they start at just $149 and they're shipped to your door in 7 days. Holy smokes, that's fast! But not as fast as my service game. Hey, who's ready to get pickled?
Get started with Noom GLP-1 today. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
Welcome to this pilot episode of Ops Normal, a podcast about Britain's Army Air Corps, the combat aviation arm of the British Army. I'm your host Johan Tasker, and we kick off this pilot episode, no pun intended, by looking at the beginning of the Army Air Corps in the wake of World War II and how it became a fully fledged fighting force. And to help us do that, we're joined by 2 Army Air Corps veterans, both military historians, John Greenacre and Mike Peters, who've written the first and only authorised operational history of the Army Air Corps, Ops Normal. It's the fighting history which draws generously on the first-hand testimony of those who were deployed on the early operations as a small embryonic group of aviators evolved into the Air Corps we know today. Mike, I think we'll start with you, not least because some listeners will already know you as the co-host of the Mighty Eights podcast that you and I already both do together, and I hasten to add will continue to do with more Mighty Eights episodes in the pipeline. Ops Normal though, Mike, tell us how this book with John came about.
That's a really good question. John and I have been talking about this as an idea for a number of years. I mean, we've known each other a long time, and one of the things about the Army Air Corps, as you'll find out as the podcast goes on, is it's a very young corps. And there have been a number of publications about it, but there's been no real comprehensive history of the Corps because it's been so busy living its life and developing and deploying on operations, etc. So it came about because the 2 of us both arrived at the same conclusion at about the same time that something had to be done.
And John, the title of the book, Ops Normal, that's going to be a familiar phrase for anyone with knowledge of the Army Air Corps, but not perhaps for the rest of us. Can you explain it?
Yeah, I think almost immediately we picked that as the working title, and then other people picked it up as the working title, and then it's just remained the title. We were expecting someone to want it to be changed, but it's survived. So Ops Normal is a radio call that aircrew will make in the absence of anything else to report. So if everything's going well but everything's quiet, then they'll report in that Ops are normal. Everybody knows that the helicopter or aircraft's still in the air and doing its job, just that it hasn't got anything to say at that particular moment in time. And so we sort of developed that because in the case of this book, it has a sort of dual meaning in that the Army Air Corps has been continuously on operations since it came into being, pretty much right up until the end of the period that we're writing about, which is the first 60 years of the Corps' history. So operations were normal for the Army Air Corps during that period of time.
You've both served in the Army Air Corps. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But you do bring different experiences to to the book. You're different. You've been friends a long time. Different but complementary. Explain that to me, John.
So I joined the Army in 1987, he said. And having been in the Army Sixth Form College, I went straight to Sandhurst and was commissioned, but originally commissioned into the Royal Corps of Transport. Spent 5 years there, then decided to try my luck in becoming aircrew and did the pilot's course, and then subsequently transferred to the Army Air Corps as a pilot, where I remained until I retired in 2011. So yeah, I was an officer throughout and aircrew, whereas Mike's experience is different.
Yeah, so I joined in 1980 at the tender age of 16 and a half as a junior leader, and the Army Air Corps was just going through one of its growing pains, and that was the recruitment of direct entry soldiers as ground crew. And you could ultimately go on to be aircrew, but you could, prior to that, people had taken a very similar path to what John's just described for an officer, where you came from another regiment or cap badge, you came along and served some time in the Army Air Corps, you liked it, you stayed, you didn't like it, you went back, whatever. But now it was like, okay, we really need our own specially trained ground crew. So that's where I came in. I was in the third intake ever of direct entry junior leader ground crew, so under 18s who joined, and I spent over 30 years in the Army Air Corps, going through the ranks as a ground crewman, driver signaller, refueler, radio operator, rearming, refueling helicopters, all of that as an instructor, until going right through the ranks to be a regimental sergeant major of a full regiment Army Air Corps, then commissioning as an officer and doing similar roles as an officer. So a total of 34 years. I left in 2013 at the age of 50. Having spent most of my time on the ground and some time in the air as an air door gunner on links. So that's another reason why we go together well, because John's experience is primarily on Gazelle reconnaissance helicopters, and mine is around links in the anti-tank role and the light battlefield utility role.
So you both joined at different times, but at some point your paths crossed.
Yeah, so we served together in 3 Regiment Army Air Corps in different squadrons, in different roles in Germany, and then we both came back to UK ultimately. And then by twist of fate, when the Army Air Corps was turning Wattisham into the main hub for the attack helicopter, the Apache, there was going to be a new headquarters, an attack helicopter force headquarters. And I was the project officer for that, and John was appointed as the operations officer for that. So we were the first 2 people ever in attack helicopter force, and we just had an empty office. At the start, I think we did have a computer.
Possibly.
But yeah, and a couple of chairs. And then the attack helicopter force grew into what it is today, this mammoth, very potent attack helicopter organisation. But we started then, and we were both also very interested in history. We both were working in our spare time in the battlefield tour industry. So we had lots of shared interests. And we, at that time, right at the start, we were both focused on Arnhem. We were both writing books about airborne forces in World War II. So we had a lot to talk about. Yeah,
and at some stage we were both invited down to Middle Wallop, which is the headquarters of the Army Air Corps. And we thought we'd been invited down to talk about the museum at the time. The museum was going through a refurbishment at the time, so we were asked to come down about that. And during a meeting, it became clear that people were talking about this book being written about the Army Air Corps' history to mark an anniversary that was coming up, the 60th anniversary in 2017. And while we sat around this table, Mike and I glanced at each other and then sort of said, well, if this is going to be written, then we should volunteer to write it, which we did. As these things do, it then took a long time. So I think that was in 2013. It took a long while for the Army Air Corps to agree how it was going to be written and how we were going to be compensated for writing it. And then eventually, a long time later, we were formally tasked to write it in 2019. But then as soon as we started writing it, then COVID hit, and that slowed the entire process down because archives shut down. It wasn't easy to move around to interview people, so that stalled the process. There was also the fact that there was just way more information and interest in the book than we first anticipated. So we were flooded with documents and people who wanted to tell their stories. And so there were two real results of that. The first is that it took much longer than we'd anticipated and that we'd promised the Army Air Corps. And second, we had to split it into two volumes. And so volume 1 was published in the summer of this year, in July of this year, and volume 2 will be following at some point next year. Yeah.
And this covers the first 60 years of the Army Air Corps, 1957 to 2017. And it is a fascinating history, isn't it? It evolved as an Air Corps rather than being formed straight away.
Yeah, and that was why we wanted to write the book. And before we go any further, we've got to tip our hat and say thank you to Colonel Chris Irons, who was the regimental secretary, who was the driving force in the headquarters. We came up with the synopsis and the ideas and what we wanted to do. And he was the guy who got the process, pushed it through and got the money approved and the consent of the Corps that we should write it. And as John said, it really was obvious that even though between us we've got over 50 years of experience with the Corps and many of the operations we've written about we deployed on, there was far more, much more than we had anticipated, and a lot of different perspectives, because even though we'd been on the same operations, we both had different views, and if you multiply that by the number of people who went on these ops and some of the external views, and you started to scrape away, even at the start when we started to do some cursory work about what the chapters would be, there were operations we'd never heard of, little things like the operation into Kuwait in 61, and we started with the Suez Canal, and on we went, and all the different, but it was, what we decided right at the start of this must absolutely only be an operational history. There's a little bit of dates of colours and guidons and the politics of it all, but it's about the Army Air Corps, whoever the people, the machines are, etc., where they were when they deployed in operations. It's not about the band or nothing. There's anything wrong with the band, or the ceremonial, or who's the colonel in chief, or any of that stuff. That's for you. It already exists in the other books. This is the bullets, the dust, the blood, the story of the Army Air Corps and operations.
The fighting history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's what we wanted to do, and that's what Chris Irons was happy for us to, the approach that he was happy for us to take. And so from the moment the Army Air Corps was formed, which we haven't mentioned the date, 1st of September 1957, on the date that it was formed, it immediately took over 3 operational theatres at that point. So there were aircrew and aircraft in Malaya, on the Malayan emergency, in Cyprus with the Cyprus emergency, and in Northern Ireland. And although it's pre-Troubles, the IRA were at that point conducting another campaign known as the Border Campaign. So there were aircraft committed to that. So it took over 3 active operations, and it was continually on operations from that point until 2014, so 3 years before our period ends in this book. And during that time, there are points where they're on. There are several points where they're on 3 or 4 operations at a time, and there's one point in the early 1960s where the Army Air Corps is committed to 5 operations at the same time. So it's busy. And the period that we're covering in Volume 1, which is really up to sort of about 1980, really, although it goes a little beyond that in places, is definitely that area that's almost a forgotten. I can't believe I just used that word. It's
I did just cringe.
Yeah, I know. It's a period of history that's less well known, but it is that period where Britain is downsizing, for want of a better word, withdrawing from its imperial possessions, and it's a period of Britain's history that I don't think is particularly well known post Second World War.
It's that whole series of what I think Michael Dewar called it brushfire wars.
Yeah,
the withdrawal from empire, and I think, as John said, it's interesting because aviation is everywhere when there's an operation. It's one of the first things the Army reaches for out of its toolbox of things it can do capabilities-wise. So, and it's quite a small corps, so you find it's on every single operation, and because the corps has lived at that tempo for all these decades, there's been no time to pause and capture that and write about it. But also, people are focused on the next one or the one they're on, and there's no time to look back. And I think one of the things that drove us to write the book was that many of the old and bolds who we knew as retired officers in tweed jackets who sat around some of the offices in Middle Wallop or other places, did policy or loaded flying courses, we just thought they're old dinosaurs or whatever. But then when we started to unearth their stories, and the guy we saw as, you know, some old duffer in a tweed cut jacket, you find a photograph of him with, you know, bare-chested with an M16 over his shoulder, having flown a scout helicopter through the desert in Aden, attacking terrorists, and you're like, wow, you know, this is the story we didn't know. So, as John said, it's not forgotten, it's just we didn't know about it. And you can apply that to the whole corps, where we were so focused on what was coming up next, the next helicopter, the next operation, whatever it was. There was no time to pause. And finally, after having left the corps, we both had time to gather these stories, collate them, present them in Ops Normal. And I think when people start to read it, and we've had feedback already, they're like, I didn't know about this, you know, and that means we're achieving our aim, I think.
I think there was a real... we were very conscious as well during that period where we'd sort of agreed to write it, but before the Corps actually directed us to write it, we were very conscious of every time you opened a newspaper, another one of these guys, his obituary was in the paper, or the Army Air Corps sent an email out to say sad news of the death of, and you think, oh, it's another person whose story we're not going to get. And so when we did start writing, particularly the guy, you know, I say guys, the men, quite old men, a lot of them, from that period, who were with the Corps from the very beginning through the 60s and 70s, they were very keen to tell their stories because, to be quite frank, nobody's been particularly interested before, and they've never had a chance to sit down and either talk about it or write about it, or some had already written about, but it was just shelved away in a box somewhere for their family to read. And so we were quite conscious of allowing those people to speak. So while we've got a lot of material out of the archives, as far as possible as well, we've tried to conduct interviews or ask veterans and serving members to write down their experiences and send them in. So we've had a considerable number of a considerable amount of testimony that's been written or spoken specifically for this book.
We'll look at some of those anecdotes and some of those stories, but going right back to the early days, in the beginning, as it were, the Army had flown aircraft, but there was this need to establish an air corps that would be under the command of the Army itself. Yeah, so if I start off, and John, because John covered this a lot in Volume 1, but you know, if you go right back to the Royal Flying Corps, so 1911, 1912, that's Army pilots flying aircraft ultimately over the Western Front, all the other fighting fronts of the Great War. And you come out of that, there's a bit of a fallow period again, and then you go into World War II, and you get the AOP, the officers in their artillery observation post aircraft, and the glider pilot regiment flying, and then out of World War II, leading up to the formation of the Army Air Corps in 1957, sort of playing at it, just keeping the capability just enough. And there's a lot of politics and to-ing and fro-ing about between the Air Force and the Army as to whether they want it, whether they can afford it, whether it'll be allowed, all of that. But ultimately, there needs to be an integral, close-in Army aviation arm of some kind, and that's ultimately where we come to in the 50s. Yeah. So just before the birth of the Corps in 1957, you get the Suez crisis in 1956, which is the first chapter of the book, which Mike wrote. And there was an organisation that took part in that called the Joint Experimental Helicopter Unit, just shortened to the Joint Helicopter Unit for the operation. And it was really the
the Air Force and the Army trying out the utility of helicopters at that point in time. And they were using Air Force and Army pilots. So Army pilots were flying helicopters off the deck of ships like HMS Ocean on to drop Royal Marines onto Suez. And that's pretty much the first time the British military, it is the first time the British military had flown troops into battle that way by helicopter. And although that's not the reason for the formation of the Air Corps, it feeds into it at that point. It's that ability for aircraft to operate maybe with soldiers in the back, or being able to speak to soldiers on the ground that have an understanding of how the ground battle works, which the Air Force don't always do. They operate in a different way. And so that was why the Army was keen to have its own aviation arm, partly so it had control over it, complete control, but also because they would have pilots that spoke the same language in military terms, and understood the same objectives, and were willing to put up with the same conditions up to a point as well as the rest of the Army. So that's where it really comes from in 1957, and then it's been a continuous process of development from there on in, pretty much.
So very much a different role to the role of, say, the RAF.
Definitely, although the RAF helicopter force evolves in parallel, it's a support helicopter force, whereas the Army is certainly reconnaissance and in and out the early days of armed action, which comes along as we get into Malaya, Borneo and Aden and the operations we've spoken about earlier. So, and you need somebody who understands the Army. John used the phrase language, and it's quite right. It's Army doctrine, Army tactics, and it's actually being on the ground to understand the repercussions of doing something or not doing something, which is important. Which, the best will in the world, a Royal Air Force trained pilot who's never been in that environment is not going to understand, or even a Royal Navy pilot for that matter is unlikely to understand. And the key thing in the mid 50s is, even then, the Air Force are talking about unmanned aircraft, rockets, jets, and helicopters just aren't sexy. So the Army can have those.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hold that serve. There's no time for pickleball because you're going to want to hear this. Noom now has GLP-1s. No way. Oh, yes way, Fred. Psychology and meds. That's how Noom helps you lose the weight and keep it off.
That's really smart.
Oh, Danny, it's Noom smart. And they start at just $149 and they're shipped to your door in 7 days. Holy smokes, that's fast. But not as fast as my service game. Hey, who's ready to get pickled?
Get started with Noom GLP-1 today. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
You're listening to Ops Normal, a pilot episode for a podcast about Britain's Army Air Corps. John, exactly what is the role of the Army Air Corps in Britain?
When it's created in 1957, largely observation at that point, and largely still fixed wing with the Oster. There are some experiments with other helicopters at the time, but at quite a slow pace. And then the Skeeter comes in as well, but because of its very low carrying capacity, really the only thing that can do as well is observation with the crew in the front. So they're observing for artillery fire, the old traditional role of the Aero P squadrons during the Second World War. And they can also observe for fast jets and do forward air control as well. And then as time develops, they begin to take on other roles. So once the aircraft become a little more capable, then they can begin to conduct roles such as casualty evacuation, which becomes really important in places like Malaya and Borneo especially, and then eventually on to some armed action as well, certainly during the period that Volume 1 covers. And then when we come on to volume 2, which we're writing at the moment, then you come right up to, within a few years of where we are now, and the Army Air Corps has developed into its own fighting arm with the Apache helicopter, and is an arm in the same way as the infantry or the armour, and part of the battle plan. So it's a slow evolution, and the roles expand and increase, and that has largely to do with what the aircraft are capable of, really.
You're both military historians who've served. You not only know what you're talking about, you've lived it. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to writing something like this? Are you too close to the subject?
It's good. It's an advantage if you're there to think, oh yeah, I remember the conditions, and you can describe things in detail and things you pull in nitty gritty. But in other ways, you come away with the baggage of your own perception of what happened. So, I'm currently working on the Operation Telic chapter 2003, so Gulf War II, and after that I'm going to go back and do Gulf War One. And we both deployed on Gulf War One, and I deployed on Gulf War Two. And I earlier last week I went and interviewed another veteran who was in the same headquarters that I was working in, and I got a whole lot of new information. I thought, I sat in the same tent as you, and I didn't know half of that was going on. So you've got to be, as John is, a professional historian, and be able to detach yourself and say, okay, I'm going to reappraise that. I know this, park that, and then go back in as if you don't know anything and ask those questions. And I've quite enjoyed that, to learn new things. The whole Wellington quote about a battle's like being at a ball. You know what's going on with the person you're dancing with, but you don't know what's going on the other side of the dance floor. So finding out what's been going on the other side of the dance floor has been really interesting from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out this, that we made the decision when we started writing that this would be written, and I'm trying not to use the words academic history because that just puts people off immediately, and it's not an academic history at all. No. But we've written it with the same rigour as an academic history, so everything is footnoted, everything is in the bibliography. So if anybody wants to check our working and see where we've got information from, it's all there laid out, or if someone wants to pursue something later. So we thought that was really important as we went through. But in terms of us both serving, I think one of the advantages has been that other veterans have probably been more willing to speak to us than they might otherwise have been, and it makes conducting interviews easier in a way, because they know that we understand the language. They don't have to keep stopping to tell us what an abbreviation means or what a different aircraft was or anything like that. So the interviews flow quite nicely. I've held interviews with guys who were Special Forces pilots for some time who probably wouldn't have spoken to anybody else, but because they know that we're aware of the sensitivities of some of the things that we're saying, and we're clearly not going to go and publish stuff that we know really shouldn't be published. So I think they've been much more confident in speaking to us, and probably we've got a lot more people to speak to us than might have been the case if we hadn't been serving members of the Corps. And even though we've been left a fair while, when our names are mentioned, there are still people who do still
vaguely remember
us, or remember our reputation at least.
And they still want to talk to you.
Yeah, and they still want to talk to us. Yeah, and are willing to talk to us. And it also means we've got access to the levers of the Army Air Corps at the top. And people that we served with are now in the high echelon. So if we need to squeeze someone to give us a hand, we know the right people to speak to nicely here and there. So I think it's been a definite advantage. We've just had to be aware, as Mike says, that we don't bring our own baggage to it while we're writing.
Yeah, and I think just to reinforce one of the points that John made about the academic rigour, because the idea was this is the authorised operational history. So this is an official history. This is not a coffee table book. This is not a cartoon book or a storybook. This is the proper history of the Army Air Corps. However, our writing styles complement each other. I'm more of a storyteller, although I do apply the rigour, but John brings that in absolute academic rigour and his own humour and witnesses, and I do it from my point of view, and those two styles work well together. And we're determined that although it is an academically founded history, it's about the human story, it's about the people. So the anecdotes, the humour, all of that is there. It is also a really good narrative of the Corps, not just the facts, figures and dates. It's much more than that. But you can rely on that narrative because it's underpinned with these academic template, and it's all as it should be, and it's all verified.
It's a book with an index, with a bibliography, with footnotes. The sources are there.
Yeah. And if you like your military history, it's got some really good maps.
Well, I was looking at it. It's got some good maps. It's also got some photos that haven't necessarily seen the light of day, certainly not widely for many years.
I think the photographs will surprise a lot of people because all the other books use the same photographs, and a few of those have had to be used, but nearly all the others are donated from people's own personal collections, or we've dug into the bottom of the archives, and the archivists at Army Flying Museum have been really helpful in that, and it wouldn't be possible without the Army Flying Museum. But they tell a story, and there are the ground crew, air crew, the aircraft, all there, and we tried to be very selective about how we lay them out and the order, and supported them with good colour maps.
You say, Mike, that John's more of the academic side. You describe yourself as more of a storyteller. There are some absolutely amazing stories in here. One that stood out for me, Major Graham Bell. Yeah,
so whose daughter was very helpful and contributed a lot to it, and his own personal memoir. He's quite a character, and he is right in there from Suez at the start with JHU, as John mentioned earlier. And they're told to launch off to a landing zone on the near the canal, and nobody knows where it is. There are no maps. They're at sea on HMS Ocean, waiting to go ashore, and no one's got a map. And told to go and land near the statue of the entrance to the canal. And he remembers his mother-in-law had been on holiday earlier, a few years earlier, and sent him a postcard with the statue next to the opening of the Suez Canal. So he said, well, that must be it from memory. So he launches his flight of helicopters off to the mouth of the Suez, knowing that's roughly where the statue must be. So that's where the helicopter landing site is, the HLS is, and off they go, based on just a postcard from his mother or mother-in-law a few years before. So he pops up all the way through. Some fantastic stories of him in Aden, and the formation of 3 Wing and 653 Squadron, all these threads of history which lead to the Army Air Corps as it is today. And he's there when they start to develop the concept of the forward operating base, a thing called the forward arming refuel point. All these things that everyone associates with much later in the Corps history. They're all being done before, and he's one of these movers and shakers at the start who come up with these ideas.
And a fascinating anecdote, Sean Bonner, John.
Sean Bonner, certainly when I was flying in the Army Air Corps, he was one of those larger-than-life living legend characters within the Army Air Corps, and had a long history, originally a paratrooper. He'd been out in Rhodesia in 1980, he'd been in the Falklands, but he was in Hong Kong very shortly, around about the time of the Falklands. He was also in Hong Kong. So it's worth just saying at this point that some of although we've said this Volume 1 goes roughly up to 1980, where an operation has continued beyond 1980, we've let it play out. So Hong Kong goes right the way through until Hong Kong is handed over as to the Chinese. But in early 1980s, the British government are changing their policy on immigration from China, and that causes a massive flood of Chinese immigrants trying to get in on the old rules. And 660 Squadron Army Air Corps with the Scout helicopter in Hong Kong is overwhelmed, has got too much work to do. So they create an Operation Kulex, and they bring more pilots in from the UK to help bolster the squadron, one of which is Sean Bonner. So they're flying every day trying to stop immigrants from crossing the border, and they do that by physically stopping them with the helicopter. So when they're coming across from Guangdong province over the Mai Po marshes and river, they are flying the scouts down at ground level and knocking Chinese immigrants over with the helicopter, and then using an air crewman in the back on a scramble net to grab them and pull them into the helicopter, take them away, where they're then arrested and deported back to China. And on this particular sortie, Sean Bonner also has a photographer from Soldier magazine on board taking photographs. And they grab 3 Chinese students out of the marshes, take them away. They're arrested, and one of them speaks quite good English and says to Sean, pointing to the photographer, "Can I have one of the photographs, please, of me being captured? Next time I come over, can I get a photograph?" And Sean says, "Well, you're not coming back over because you're going to be sent to Mongolia or somewhere, but sure, if you come back over, you can have a photograph." Forgets all about it, and a few weeks later, he's in the squadron bar on a Friday afternoon. He gets a call from the main gate of the camp saying there's a Chinese fellow here that would like to speak to Sergeant Bonner. So Sean Bonner goes to the gate and finds, sure enough, there is this Chinese guy that was deported a few weeks ago who's now crossed again, wearing a smart suit and speaking English. So Sean says to him, "Well, an agreement's an agreement. Come back next Friday." So the Chinese student returns next Friday, by which time Sean has got one of the photographs from Soldier magazine, had it framed, everybody has signed it. They bring the Chinese student into the bar. He has a beer. They present him with the photograph, and away he goes. So there are these types of stories which are, it's quite a serious business in what's going on, and a lot of the aircrew that take part in that operation are quite disturbed by what they're doing by picking up immigrants and sending them back across the border. They don't enjoy doing it. But there is there's these moments of humour and a bit of humanisation of it as well as you go, and they appear throughout, all the way through. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, and that's what's unique about this history compared to some of the others is these anecdotes, these stories. That one is a great example where it gives you an example of the type of flying that's being done with those aircraft, and people who serve now, people from the outside the army, can look back and they were all. Those aircraft, what did they actually do, And you find that with the Sioux and the Scouts, the Alouette, some of the flying that these guys undertook in those aircraft is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, some of the gun battles that they got involved in the Aden chapter, I wrote the Aden chapters, they got fixed firing machine guns on each side of the Scout and a waist gunner, and hit and run gun battles with the terrorists and insurgents, SAS guys in the back being dropped off and dropping smoke, and then Sioux in the valleys directing Hawker Hunter jets onto targets. It's really gritty, boys' own stuff, and you read it and you say, "I'm going to have to read that again. I can't believe they did that." And that's what I think the essence of this history is compared to others. We've both said, "I can't believe they did that," and you verify it, you footnote it, and it's all been done. It's irrefutable, and you think this is why this history is so important compared to what's gone before.
You both mentioned the Scout helicopter. This could almost be a biography of the Scout.
Yeah, there's a lot of aircraft in there that people will be familiar with, and Mike's mentioned the Sioux and the Scout, and in Volume 1, towards the end of Volume, and the Alouette as well, although that's in limited numbers, and then towards the end of the volume you've got the Gazelle, and right at the end the Lynx coming in, which will feature more in Volume 2. And also on the fixed-wing side, the Oster to begin with, and then the Beaver, and then later the Islander and the Defender come in as well. But in particular the Scout, because the Scout is the first helicopter that the Army has as a purpose-built Army helicopter. Although there's a naval variant as well, the Wasp. But aircraft that have come before that have either been taken from another country, like the Sioux, from the United States and adapted, or there have been civilian helicopters that have been taken in and adapted. But the Scout starts as a Saunders Roe aircraft, and then when Saunders Roe emerged after 1957, then Westland take it over, and it first entered service in 1960, but doesn't fly operationally till a little after that, and it's one of those aircraft that appears, it's in Malaya, it's in Borneo, it's in Hong Kong, it's in the Falkland Islands, it's in Northern Ireland. Yeah, it just appears time and time again. And when it first began, it was doubted by the people when it first began. It had a Rolls-Royce Nimbus engine, which was hugely unreliable when it first entered service. And it was reckoned that the engine life was less than 10 hours for each engine. You'd have to replace it the entire engine after 10 hours. And there were several instances of the whole fleet being grounded when there were problems. It had an ergonomic problem in that the cabin heater lever was right next to and worked in the same sense as the fuel cut-off lever. And so there were at least 4 crashes that were attributed to people trying to switch the heater off and switching the fuel off, some of which were unfortunately fatal, some of those accidents. So it wasn't without its issues, but they were overcome in its first few years. And then it just becomes this persistent, everywhere, different environments. Aden as well, in the jungle, in urban areas, in the deserts, in the mountains. It's rugged. Mike said earlier, it's like a Land Rover with rotor blades. And the pilots, and it had missiles fitted, had the SS-11 as the first anti-tank missile helicopter as well. So yeah, you're right. The story of the Scout is certainly the story of of Volume 1. By the time we get into Volume 2, it'll have drifted a little, and then it's the Gazelle and the Lynx that take up much of that. But as the first purpose-built Army helicopter, it's interesting to see how it pops up throughout the volume.
Yeah, and I think the current generation would probably laugh if I said this, but it was the Army Air Corps' first attack helicopter, and it was used as an attack helicopter, certainly in the Middle East. And whereas now you look at it, and for the non-aviation geeks out there, if you watch Lewis Collins and Who Dares Wins, that's the Scout helicopter where they assault the embassy in that the SAS come in. That's 656 Squadron in the Scout. With that raspy sound it's got and the broad skids and all that, but it was a groundbreaking aircraft. So you're right, it does loom large through the chronology of Volume 1 because it looms large in the core. But we mustn't forget the Beaver fixed wing. At the same time, was similar sort of profile. It's a really rugged aircraft designed to operate in the wastelands of Canada, and that looms. And one of the roles of the Army Air Corps dips in and out of is parachute resupply, because the RAF don't want them to do it, but in Aden they do it, and also they fit it with bombs. At the end they use it as a bomber, which is they're not allowed to do because that's the agreement. The RAF do bombing, we don't. So these aircraft and these men who flew these aircraft, and it was all men in Volume 1, there's no female pilots, we'll come on to that in Volume 2, really are remarkable.
Picture this, you're halfway through a DIY car fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realise you're missing a part. It's okay, because you know whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything, brakes, headlights, cold air intakes, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love.
Hold that serve. There's no time for pickleball because you're going to want to hear this. Noom now has GLP-1s. No way! Oh, yes way, Fred. Psychology and meds. That's how Noom helps you lose the weight and keep it off.
That's really smart.
Oh, Danny, it's Noom smart. And they start at just $149 and they're shipped to your door in 7 days. Holy smokes, that's fast! But not as fast as my service game. Hey, who's ready to get pickled?
Get started with Noom GLP-1 today. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
You're listening to Ops Normal, a pilot episode for a podcast about Britain's Army Air Corps. Mike, I think you've said yourself, in the beginning, penny packets of aircraft were being begged and borrowed from the RAF. By the time we get really into this book, what we're looking at is very much a fully fledged fighting force. Yeah, as John said, it's a combat arm alongside the infantry and the armoured corps. That's where we are now. And Volume 2, as I said, I'm doing the Iraq chapter now. That's the first time an aviation battle group is actually deployed in a war-fighting role. So there's that whole progression. And it is evolution, not revolution, definitely. But it is a steady, forceful evolution that happens as we go along. So it's interesting to see that and how people develop alongside that and how the corps develop. I mean, my own story of being a direct entrant, by the time we get to Volume 2, we'll see that
change. But Volume 1 is very much the pioneers, the groundbreaking ideas of how we're going to do this. And you mentioned Graham Bell, and he's one of these guys. And one of the quotes in the book that he makes is that it's so important for the Army Air Corps to be as close to the front line and as close to the troops it's supporting as is possible, so that you feel the battle and you react to it and you bring your resources forward, so the transit time is reduced. And that, people would think, oh, that's what we do now, but they were doing that far earlier. They'd realised that much earlier. In fact, actually, John will probably say the same. If you go back to World War II, that's what the Osters were doing, as close to the front line as they could be. And that is the essence of the Army Air Corps. That's the difference between an Army Air Corps squadron and an RAF squadron.
I think it's worth saying during the period that Volume 1 covers as well that at times the Army Air Corps' existence was quite tenuous during that period. So having been formed in 1957 in the sort of early 1960s, early to mid-1960s, there was suddenly this thought that, actually these small aircraft are clearly quite useful in the Army. Wouldn't it be much better if every regiment had its own aircraft? So not every single infantry battalion, but a lot of infantry battalions, a lot of armoured battalions, even some artillery regiments were given a couple of aircraft, initially Osters and then later the Sioux helicopter, and in a few cases Beaver as well, to operate as a single battalion with a couple of helicopters, which did pay dividends in places like Borneo, for instance, because it meant a commanding officer could get around much more easily to see his troops in the jungle. It meant that casualty evacuation could be done much more quickly. So there were some advantages to that system. The disadvantage, or one of them, was it looked like, well, what's the point of having the Army Air Corps then? If every regiment can have its own helicopters, we don't need why would we need an Army Air Corps, a central organisation? So the Army Air Corps is definitely in a slightly sticky situation at that point. But the other disadvantage of running that system is it's massively inefficient, and so and also unsupervised to a certain extent. So you've got pilots in various regiments who are not being properly supervised, and you've got technicians in various regiments spread around the entire globe. Spare parts have to be sent around the entire globe, and it's really inefficient, and it brings the whole system close to breaking point essentially. And the Army has to admit that although there are some advantages to that system, it's called the integrated flight scheme. They're going to have to re-centralise, and so towards the mid and the back end of the 1960s, they draw all those aircraft back off those regiments, back into the Army Air Corps. And that's the point where the Army Air Corps then forms up into squadrons and regiments. And so by the time you get to the end of Volume 1, the Army Air Corps looks much more like the rest of the Army. So it goes from 1957 of being sort of individual flights dotted around, then this strange period of the integrated flight scheme. Whereas at the end, you've got what the rest of the Army can identify as something that looks normal to them. Squadrons, regiments, Army Air Corps in their own barracks, and so you can say, well, the artillery are in that barracks there, the engineers are in that barracks, or the Army Air Corps in that barracks there, and it's much easier to point to them and point to the Army Air Corps and say this is what they do. So certainly by the end of Volume 1, the Army Air Corps has gone through its teething pains essentially, and then it grows throughout Volume 2 up to the point where it becomes the fully fledged teeth arm and battle winner, essentially.
You say, Mike, that it's not a coffee table book, but it is a proper book. It's 400 pages. It's hardback. It's got heft. It's well worth having.
It is, and whenever someone picks it up, the first thing they say is, "God, this weighs a bit," So there's a lot in there, and I've got to say thank you to Duncan Rogers at Helion for that, because we came in with a concept of what the book was content-wise, and I'd seen a book, another 2-volume history that had been done by Helion, and showed it to John, and we both agreed that this is what we wanted. It needed to be credible in all respects, not just the content but the presentation, so that people would want it, people would keep it, and people would read it. And I think we've achieved that. and it is dedicated to all the Army Air Corps personnel who've deployed in operations. Particularly those who have lost their lives, male and female. So it's and that's the idea. That's what it is. So we're into Volume 2, and that will complement Volume 1, obviously.
Yeah, and I'd echo that, because I think Duncan Rogers at Helion went out on a limb a little bit to produce a book of this quality, because there were times that we thought maybe we'd have to compromise, but he allowed us to continue to pursue the book the way we wanted it to be. So it is, and as Mike said, it gets. Even if people haven't read it, which is a comment I've had a lot, I've got your book, but I haven't read it. They compliment just the quality of the book as well. And can I go back and say something about the museum? Because I'm not sure this book could have been written much before the time that we wrote it, because around about the time of the 60th anniversary of the Army Air Corps in 2017, the museum, which is at Middle Wallop beside the regimental headquarters, just off the A303, it had a heritage lottery grant to extend and improve the museum, and part of that was they had a purpose-built archive built with a full-time archivist, and we've really benefited from that. There have been 3 full-time archivists while we've been writing this, successive archivists, Marilyn and then Kyle and now Henry, and they've all been massively helpful to us, as has the rest of the museum as well. They've all been massively helpful to us, and to be able to call the museum and say, I'm going to come down in a couple of weeks, I want to look at Malaya or I want to look at Cyprus, and you arrive and all the information you want is already there. It's been laid out, it's in boxes. They've helped us find the images. Anytime we're not sure of a full name of someone that we're talking about, you can call the museum or email them, and they'll come back pretty quickly with the information that you're after. So if someone had tried to write this prior to when we've begun writing it, it would have been a much more difficult, task. Yeah.
So what's in the book and what isn't, John?
So Volume 1 then covers roughly from the formation of the Corps, or a little before because it includes Suez, up until about 1980, really 1979. That's for when operations began. If an operation runs beyond that date, beyond 1979, then we've continued it until it finishes. So, for instance, Cyprus begins in 1957 but runs right through until 1994. Hong Kong runs right through until the end there. So those operations run right through. The only exception to that is Northern Ireland. Because Northern Ireland is such a huge subject on its own, we have split that. So in Volume 1 it runs up until 1979, and then Volume 2 runs up until the end of the Troubles and a little beyond that in 2006 and through to the closing date of Volume 2 in 2017. So Volume 1 covers Suez. There's a small chapter on the formation of the Corps, and then Malaya, Borneo, Hong Kong, Cyprus, Aden, British Guyana, Belize, and then Northern Ireland up until 1979. Yeah, and then when we come on to Volume 2, or it's been written at the time, that will finish off Northern Ireland, Rhodesia, the Falkland Islands, the first Gulf War, Sierra Leone,
Balkans.
The second Gulf War, and then into Afghanistan and finishing with Libya. So we had to split it. We had to split it somewhere, really. So and that's sort of how it worked out fairly naturally, really.
But what's not in there is British Army of the Rhine and Germany, the Hell Arm, and the NATO exercises, all that, because we don't class that as an operation. That was an enduring commitment where people were stationed in Germany and associated with that exercises in Canada, etc. But if units deployed from Germany into Northern Ireland or whatever, then they come onto our writing radar screen as such. So that's a separate subject, the Cold War and those heady days in Germany.
Yeah, I think when we first planned it, we thought maybe, I think somewhere I've got a synopsis that has BAOR in it, but it's such a massive subject and also doesn't quite fit the same operational tone that we've been covering. So fairly early in the process, we decided we weren't going to cover, British Army of the Rhine and some of the spin-offs of that. And, one day that might be a separate book.
Not for this call sign.
Mike Peters, John Greenacre, thank you very much. And copies of Ops Normal are available from the Army Flying Museum, direct from publisher Helion, for a recommended retail price of £35 Great British pounds, although you can get it for less if you shop around online. We'll put a few links on the show notes page to this episode of Ops Normal, this pilot episode of the podcast about Britain's Army Air Corps. For now, though, thank you to John Greenacre and Mike Peters for taking the time to talk to us. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. Thank you for listening.
To get people excited about Boost Mobile's new nationwide 5G network, we're offering unlimited talk, text, and data for $25 a month.
Forever.
Even if you have a baby.
Even if your baby has a baby.
Even if you grow old and wrinkly and you start repeating yourself.
Even if you start repeating yourself.
Even if you're on your deathbed and you need to make one last call.
Or text.
Right, or text the long-lost son you abandoned at birth.
You'll still get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile.
Forever!
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
Forever!
If you're looking for flexible workouts, Peloton's got you covered. Summer runs or playoff season meditations. Whatever your vibe, Peloton has thousands of classes built to push you. We know how life goes. New father, new routines, new locations. What matters is that you have something there to adapt with you, whether you need a challenge or rest. And Peloton has everything you need whenever you need it. Find your push. Find your power. Peloton. Visit onepeloton.com.
Get ready to turn that idea of yours into a successful side hustle without sacrificing time for the other things in your life. No matter your field, Wix's chat-based AI can help you get your website up and running in minutes so you can start achieving your goals. And don't worry if you don't have all the answers. Who does, right? AI-powered campaigns, SEO, market insights. We're always there for you. From launching your part-time passion to growing it into your full-time career. Head over to Wix.com and start creating today.